Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting Fulgrim Transfigured for the Horus Heresy by Games Workshop. Now this is an amazing miniature. It's really large and it's packed with details, but it's also quite a complex one to put together. So if you're fairly new to the hobby, I do recommend you get some practice with some smaller resin kits before you tackle this one. But in this video what we're going to be doing is showing you how to paint it from start to finish using some techniques that are easy to replicate so you can get a great result with your miniature on the tabletop. We hope you enjoy it. Let's get to it. To paint a large and complex model like Fulgrim, what you need to do is look for some sub-assemblies as you're putting the model together to make it easy to paint the miniature, to help out with access to various parts, and that's exactly what I've done with this miniature just here. You can see I've got quite a few parts kept separate, starting out with the lower body, which is basically the serpent part, and also I've kept the upper body separate from that. But then I've also got the two bits of fabric that go on the back of the body. I've kept them separate to allow easier access to the scales, and also I've kept off the wings. Now when it comes to areas like the wings, we've actually got a big advantage here because it means we can undercoat them a different colour from other parts of the model. So in this case what I've gone for is Wraithbone Spray, which will be a great starting point for that really pale sort of pinkish skin tone he's got. Meanwhile, for everything else, I've used Standard Grey from the Colour Forge, which is a really good starting point for all the different purples that we've got on there. So that's why I've chosen that. Now what we're going to do is start out by painting some of that very intricate armour, and what we should do here is look to that trim first of all, because it's really intricate this. So what we're going to do is paint that in roughly first of all, and then we can be neat as we start blocking the armour panels around it. And it's quicker to do it this way around than it would be to paint the armour panels followed by that trim. So what we need is a really nice rich gold. I'm going to use some Dragon's Gold for this, and to apply it I'm going for my good old rough base coating brush to get things going. So this is a medium base coat brush here from Citadel. It's definitely seen better days, but it's ideal for our purposes here where we can be quite rough. And what we need to do is use it to thin the paint down as usual, just being careful not to overdo it with a brush of this size because it can absorb a lot of water very quickly. Just want to get that nice and thin, and then it's time to start applying it to the armour panel trim and also any of the gold details you can find like gems, the sword hilts, that sort of thing. So we start on his upper body. You can see there's plenty of it here, and it is quite elaborate as we go around the chest plate and down around the belly and things just around here. I'm just looking for that trim, and I just want to make sure I get it gold at this stage, not at all being concerned about anything else because we'll neaten up as we go along with those other base coat colours. See, all areas like this and the gold around the front just here. Now this gold does turn up on lots of the various assemblies, so just keep an eye out for it because it's on just about all of them except for the wings really. For example, on the snake tail that we've got just here, you can see we've got all this armour going down the front. We want to make sure we get this painted gold at this stage too. So once again, not concerned about anything else, just looking for the detail that we want to be gold. I finished roughly base coating all that gold, and you can see I applied two thin coats here just to make sure we have a really nice rich colour to really go with the theme of the miniature. And now what we're going to do is apply a wash over the top of it, and in this case we're going to do something unusual because we're actually going to go for a purple wash here to really drive home the celestial feel of the miniature. Now at this stage, if you haven't already, be sure to clean your water because you're going to have loads of metal flakes floating around in there, and this will contaminate your wash as you apply it. So you definitely want some clean water for this. And then it's time to pick a purple wash. Now I'm going to use some Druchii Violet for this, and to apply it I'm actually going to use a regiment brush from the Army Painter. Now even though I'm going to be putting on quite a lot of this paint, the reason why I'm going for a brush of this size, sort of a medium to large brush, is because a lot of the detail on the miniature is very delicate and very fine, and I don't want to swamp it with too much of this paint and lose that strength of detail essentially. So it's going for that smaller brush just to mean that I'm not going to put on quite so much at once, so it's less likely that we're going to clog any detail basically. And what we want to do is just get a generous amount loaded on the brush and start painting it directly over all that gold. Now like with the base coat of the gold, we don't have to worry about catching anything else at this stage. All that matters is we get all the gold trim. So for example, if I paint it on here, it doesn't matter about getting it on the armour plates, but it is really important that all that gold gets shaded with it. So all around there like that. Now also keep an eye out for any of the details you have painted gold, such as the grips of the swords, anything like that. And once you have got this painted over, give it plenty of time to dry. This sort of quantity, it's going to take around about half an hour, but just be sure it is completely dry before you move on to the next stage. That purple wash is now completely dry, and you can see the results. It gives us a really lovely purple tint on all of that gold, and it also very clearly marks out the details, so you can see just how intricate a lot of that trim is, which means we're now at the perfect stage for base coating lots of details around it, because everything's nice and, well, clear essentially. So what we're now going to do is start base coating a whole host of colours that can all share a black wash, and the first of these needs to be the purple for the armour plating. And for this, appropriate enough, what we need is some Venetian purple. Now to apply this, what I'm going to do is start out with a size 1 brush from Artis Opus. So a nice medium-sized brush with a good point on it. But throughout this stage, you will need to change brushes fairly frequently to different sizes depending on what area you're doing, because all these details here, they can be, as you see now, quite intricate. So you might need to switch to smaller brushes to work around some of the swirls and things like that. So just whatever you're comfortable with. The process is the same throughout, however. Now you just got to thin the paint down with that water, and just make sure it's smooth, and then remove the excess paint off your brush so that you've got a fine point on the bristles just there. And then it's time to just start looking for all those panels and colouring them in, basically. So, for example, on the front of his body just here, you can see we've got all this trim going around these panels. We're looking for the flat areas, and we just want to colour them in with this colour. So around here, for example, just being really careful with that gold trim, around here as well, and just taking our time throughout all these parts. Now you can see the colour is a bit translucent, so once you've got that first coat on there and it's completely dry, just apply a second thin coat over the top. And here we have the model with all of that purple painted in on the armour. Now if you look closely at some parts, there are some little bits where I have splashed slightly onto the gold. So for example, just around this part, just here and just here. As long as it's small amounts though, that's perfectly fine, because later on we are going to come back to this to layer that gold and clean it all up. So don't worry if you have any small mistakes, but if you have any larger ones, you'll definitely want to clean it with some gold and purple wash at this stage. But with that done, what we're now going to do is move on to another purple, because we need to base coat those darker purple scales that appear on its tail. Now in this case, I'm going to go for Naggaroth Night, which isn't hugely different from Venetian purple, but it is a bit darker, and we are going to take it further and make it darker later on to get a bit more of a difference in there. But for the moment, we need to base coat it. Now I'm actually going to be starting out using a medium shade brush to apply this, because these scales are really large and quite easy to get to, so it's a good starting brush for this, but you might want to have a smaller one on hand when you get close to the armour plates on the front of that sort of serpent tail that he's got. But entirely up to you, of course, what size you go for, but whatever the case, as usual, make sure the paint's thinned down and that your brush isn't overloaded. Then it's time to start looking for these scales, and we're looking for the highly textured ones around here on the back. And at this stage, I'm just going to block these in entirely, making sure we work the paint into all the nooks and crannies as we go, not being concerned about the lighter scales on the front here, because we're going to pick them out later on. I finished base coating all those darker purple scales now, and definitely take your time as you're doing the inside around about there, because it can be a little bit tricky getting your brush into that area, but just poke it around to make sure you got them all with a good coat of the paint, and then we're ready to move on to another colour of scale, because now we need to do those ones that are on the underside, so almost like the belly of the serpent essentially. In this case we need a lighter greyish purple, so I'm going to be using some Warp Fiend Grey for this. To apply it, I'm going for my size 1 brush for a bit more control and accuracy now, but as usual feel free to change as you need to as you're blocking this in. And basically what we're looking for are these wider scale things that appear on the front of the body. So once your paint's ready, we can start identifying them. It's these parts right around here. Just want to block each one in, just being neat and tidy as we get close to the darker scales. So you can see around here, just take your time, making sure just to keep the paint off the darker area, but bringing this lighter greyish purple right up to them. And here we have the tail with that greyish purple applied. You can see on all those plates going on the inner side around there. And with that done, we're now going to move on to a number of base coat colours that appear all across the various assemblies, but again can all share the same wash that we're building up to. We're going to start out with an off black here, and that's going to be some Death Reaper. There's going to be things like the spike on his tail, but also keep an eye out for black fabric, and also we can pick out any sort of like ridged cables and things in the miniature. Now once that's done, we'll move on to Gal Vorbak Red for some fabric parts need to be picked out with some red and a little detail on the tail too. And after that, it's then time for some Incubi Darkness for the various horns on the miniature. Finally, we're going to be using a bit of boar hide, and this is for some leather that appears on the tail assembly once again. So quite a small part, but we do need to pick it out at that stage. But we're going to start out with some Death Reaper, and to apply this, I'm largely going to be using my size 1 brush, but as usual, change as you need to, because these parts are all kinds of shapes and sizes. What we're looking at to begin with is going to be the big spike that appears on the end of his tail. So we're looking at this part just here. So we've got this really large sort of almost scythe-like one right here, but there's also a few little horns coming out underneath it. So we want to make sure we get all of these at this stage. So again, just neatly block them in at this point. Now, in addition, we need to look out for black fabric, and that's some of the sub-assemblies we got. Remember, those two almost skirt-like parts that we've kept separate. For example, this one right here, again, we're just looking to base coat it black, and it's all the fabric at this stage. So we're looking at this recessed part around here. Don't worry about the trim. Doesn't matter if you catch it, but it's the main body of it just here. Finally, also keep an eye out for any ridged cables that appear in the assembly. There are some around Fulgrim's head. Be sure to get those at this stage as well. Once you finish base coating that black detail, it's then time to move on to base coating the wine red. And for this, I'm using some Gal Vorbak red, and to start out with, on the fabric, we're looking at the trim that appears in this raised up detail just here. We just want to very carefully pick this out, mostly skimming with the side of the brush just to pick out that detail from amongst the black. Now you can see this colour is quite weak, so you will need to do a few thin coats of this colour, but just bear in mind to take your time on this trim, but also look out for a few of the details too. The first is any of these ribbons that appear coming out of the miniature, and there are some coming out of the armour, but also on the tail there's like a fleshy part around those spikes, so be sure to base coat that with this colour too. Once you've built up that red and got a nice even base coat, it's then time to move on to the horns. And in this case, we're going to be going for some Incubi Darkness for a really dark greenish tint, which again, we're going to wash black to make it really dark. But at this stage, we just need to make sure we base coat them with this colour. So we're looking at the horns such as just up here. Just want to make sure we're nice and tidy whenever we get close to any gold on the miniature. And then finally, it's time to move on to some boar hide. So a nice warm leather colour, and this is going to be for these straps that appear on the front of the serpent body, which you can see crisscrossing around here, and then they go around onto the back. And with that done, we've now finished applying all the base coat colours that can share that black wash. So it's time to paint on the black wash. And in this case, I'm going to go for some Oblivion Black. And to apply it, I'm going to start out with a slightly smaller brush now, going for a size 0, because to begin with, we need quite a bit of control to get this onto the purple armour plates. But as ever, just change as you need to. For example, when you're doing the tail, there's quite a large area just to wash over. In that case, just switch to a bigger brush just to cover a bit more ground quickly. But to start out with, I'm making sure I don't have tons of this on the brush, because I'm going to begin by looking at these armour plates where we've got the purple parts in the middle. What we want to do is carefully go in and one at a time just wash it over the purple areas, just letting that wash just lap up to that gold but not onto it. So this way we get some nice distinction between the two areas. So this is going to be now over all the colours that we've added since we washed that gold. So there's quite a few here, including things like the horns. So for example, we want to wash all over this, we want to do all the red, all the black, all these areas that we painted in, just give them a good coat of a black wash. The black wash is now completely dry, giving us all that shading on those various colours, and in some places things might be a little bit murky, for example that sort of paler greyish purple there on some of those scales, but don't worry about that because we will clean it up later. But before we do, we've got another base coat that we need to add, which is going to be a pitch black for some black leather. And this is for one of his arms, it's like the glove he's got on, and for this you need a pitch black. So I'm going to use some Doom Death Black here, and to apply it I'm going for my size 1 brush. And with this colour, it's just a matter of base coating this feature at this stage. So as ever, make sure your paint's nicely thinned down. And once you've got your brush loaded up, it's time to paint this area. And what we're looking at is this arm right here and his hand. So we just want to make sure we get all the leather that covers this limb, just going all the way down here. Once you finish base coating that black, we can then move on to the next phase of painting the miniature, which is going to be to do a little bit of dry brushing on the scales on his tail, because dry brushing is an ideal technique for such a highly textured area, but it is possible that it will catch surrounding details. So if we do it now before any layering, then what we can do is clean up when we do that layering. So that's why we're doing this now, starting out with some Naggaroth Night. And to apply this, I'm going for a small dry brush here from Citadel. What we need to do is just set this up for some dry brushing. So just get a little bit of that paint on the tip of the brush, then get some tissue paper and start working it into the bristles and also removing the excess paint. Now we can afford to be quite generous with this colour because it is quite a dark purple, so just bring it down to about this sort of point where you're getting this strength of paint appearing on the texture of the paper, then we can start applying it to the miniature. And so we're looking for these scales here, the darker ones on the back, and the idea is just to start dry brushing across them so we start to get this purple reappearing on the raised up edges of it, but not falling into the recesses between each scale. So just roughly there, like that. Now as you get up to this area here, just take care not to go quite to the corner where you meet those green spines going there and the actual gold around there too. So do your best just to keep a short distance away so you get some shading between the two. But when you get down to the lighter grey here, it's just about inevitable that you will catch some of it as you're doing this. But just try to keep it to a minimum as you work your way around here. But don't worry if you do catch them, because we are going to clean these parts up later on. Once you've built up that dry brush to this point, we're then ready to take it further with some much lighter purples. And so now what we're going to do is move on to some Sorcerer's Cloak. So quite a big step up here, and then we're going to go even further with some Runic Purple. Finally, we're going to apply a very small amount of Slaanesh Grey just to really finish it off and help those scales pop out. But what we need to do is start out with that Sorcerer's Cloak, and it's going to be a dry brush once again. So I'm back to that small dry brush, which I've made sure is clean, but also completely dry before starting this. That is really important with this technique to make sure things don't go streaky as you're applying it. But set up, just like before, work the paint into the bristles and really remove a lot of it this time until you're getting this sort of appearance happening on the paper, you see, so lighter than before. Now the application is the same sort of technique, just lighter, so a bit more of a flicking motion. So if we look at these scales down here, for example, I'm just going to lightly go at them, just flicking back and forth like this, so that the paint only has a moment to catch those sharper edges and that ridge down the center of each scale. So it's just a matter of just working my way down all the scales very lightly, just building up the color to this point. You can see with that lighter purple applied, the scales are now starting to stand out, but we need to take it even further. So now I'm going to dry brush with some Runic Purple. And this is the same sort of application, just a little bit lighter than before, so the lighter color catches the end of each scale. And then finally we can move on to Slaanesh Grey, and with this it's going to be a dry brush once more, just very lightly this time, just a fine flicking of this colour just to get a nice highlight on the tips of each scale. With that dry brushing done now, you can see all the scales are standing out really nicely. And if you have caught any surrounding details, it doesn't matter because now we're going to move on to the layering stage, which means we can clean that up as we go along. And for the layering, we're going to start out with one of the most important colours on the miniature, which is going to be the gold. And for this, we need to return to our original gold. So I'm going back to Dragon's Gold for this. And to apply it, I'm going for a size 0 brush here. And for this particular colour with the layering, I do recommend going for smaller brushes because this gold, as you well know by now, is very intricate. So you will need that fine control as you're doing this part. The trick is to make sure the paint's thinned down so it's a little bit runny, but then just make sure you don't overload your brush. And because it is nice and thin, it will flow well from your brush, but this way you're also not going to put on too much paint at once so it won't just fall out of control. So that's the sort of thing we're looking for here. With that prepared then, we can start looking for all the gold features, and the idea is to apply this colour onto the flat area whilst avoiding the recesses. So if we look at this little bit that we've got around here, you can see just how intricate it is. I'm looking at flat areas such as just here, being careful of the little bolts and rivets and things that are in the armour, leaving the shading around those parts, but always instead looking for flatter areas. So you can see it's quite intricate. It's basically just dotting it onto these small areas, but it is the same technique working all the way around areas like that to get that shine back. Now there are some larger areas, such as on the big wing that we've got coming off the chest just here. It's the same process here, where we're looking for flat areas such as this part going up here. So want to apply it flat to that part, but as you get to any recessed areas, and as we get down here, you can definitely see amongst all this feather design we've got some. We just have to be careful of those darker areas and just keep away from them, just focusing on the flat parts, such as around here. And there we are with that gold layered. We've now passed one of the longer stages of painting the miniature, and you can see the results quite profound here in that it makes the gold all nice and shiny once again, but we still have that strange sort of purple hint in the recesses, so perfect for that Slaaneshi feel. And with that done, we're now going to move on to layering the purple armour plates, and for this, again, we're going to go back to the original colour we used. So in this case, that's going to be Phoenician purple. To apply it, I'm going for the same brush that I just used, so using the size 0 once again, and with this colour now, we just need to colour in the plates, but more focused this time towards the middle of each panel, leaving it darker in the recess where it meets all that gold trim. So once we've got the paint thinned down and ready for the purpose, just like we did when we were originally base coating it actually, we can start looking for these areas. And so for example, you can see we've got all these purple panels that are on the front of the body around here. We're just looking to colour in the middle of them. So if I go for this one right here, I'm just focusing in this sort of region just there, just leaving it darker in the recess that goes around the outside corner where the purple meets the gold. And by doing this, what we get is that main colour re-established, but we also retain the definition that we got from the wash. And with that done, you can now see we've got a nice clean finish to all of that gold and the purple armour as well. So it's time to move on to a bit more layering because there are some other colours that we need to do this with. And we'll start out by returning to Warp Fiend Grey. This is going to be on the tail just to clean up those paler plates that we've got on the underside of the serpent tail. Now once that's done, it's then back to that wine colour. So Galvorback Red, and this needs to be layered too just to make it a bit cleaner and a bit brighter. But first of all, we need Warp Fiend Grey, and to do this one, I'm using my size 0 brush again, but as usual, feel free to change as you need to as you're doing this colour, because we're looking at some quite large open areas really that do get tricky as the tail really starts winding itself around, so just change as you need to as you go through that area. Well, the process is going to be a matter of just looking for these plates and concentrating on the flatter area of them. So on this one, for example, I just want to apply a thin coat of this colour into this area just to re-establish this colour, but just being careful not to drop into the recesses as we encounter them. So you can just see I'm being careful not to go to the dark area where we meet the other plate above it. So I'm just keeping a nice distinction between the two just there. And as I get to the edge, I'm also being really careful around the purple scales around there. And with that done, we can finally move on to layering with red. And here I'm using Gal Vorbak red, and we're looking for all the red details. So we can see we've got this red fleshy part on the tail that I'm doing here, again with the technique of looking for the flatter raised areas and carefully avoiding the shaded recesses, but also be sure to do it on the other red parts too, such as the designs on the fabric and also the red ribbons coming off the armour. And with that, those colours are now layered, and if we just review whereabouts we are in painting the miniature at this stage, we've actually painted the vast majority of the physical form of the miniature. So now what we're going to do is look to complete these areas, because once they're all highlighted and finished, we're actually going to be looking at a series of smaller features. One of those will be the skin, of course, but all these parts are going to be smaller areas that we can just complete one at a time to get things done. So by this way, what we're going to do is actually win a bit of a psychological battle here, because this miniature is very large and complicated, and so once all these areas are highlighted, we're actually over halfway through with all those details completed. So with that in mind, what we're now going to do is highlight the gold, and this is going to be the longest stage of painting the miniature as we do this, so brace yourself for this one. What we want is quite a bright gold here, so I'm going to use some glistening gold to get things going, and to apply it I've gone for a really small brush here. I've gone for a size 00, and with this colour we're looking to accentuate all the sharp edges and corners of all that gold detail in the miniature. And this is all of it, of course, including the swords, things like that. Just need to work your way through it systematically, looking for these edges and picking them out. So if we take a look at the front of his armour, you can see we've got all this golden banding going off around here. What we want to do is look for the edge of it and follow along. So that means areas such as just here, just following it all the way around using the tip of the brush, just so we get that brighter gold line just following that outside edge. So just along there like that, for example. There's also all these rivets and things that we just want to dot and pick out as we go along, but really it's going to be basically this process throughout all the gold detail, which as you can see is quite intricate in places, so you just got to really take your time, make sure you're nice and steady and just very gently moving with the tip of the brush, looking for that edge and picking it out. And there we are, the highlight's been applied to that gold. And even though that stage did take a while, it is an important stage to go through because gold is a big feature of a model like this. So just take your time, keep at it, and it'll be done before you know it. And with that done, we're now going to take the gold a little bit further as it's such a major miniature. And for this, what we now need is a platinum colour. I'm going to use some platinum crown for this, and what we're looking at doing is a fine edge highlight here. So it's not quite as much as the previous one. It's going to take nowhere near as long, but we still need the same sort of brush. So once again, I'm using my size 00. We need to get the paint ready in the same sort of way. Just making sure it's nice and smooth. Make sure there's not loads on the brush, and then with this we're now looking for sharper corners. So rather than doing the edges on everything like we were in all the previous gold areas, we're now looking for parts that stand out, such as on this big wing design he's got, and little corners like this one right here, which I want to apply the paint in the same way but focusing it on that actual corner there like that. And what this does is just emphasises these sharp parts and makes them pop out a little bit more. So you can see I'm always looking around, just looking for parts that are sharp edges and points and things like that, and just skimming a little bit of this colour onto those parts. Once you've finished applying that highlight, all the gold detail will be complete, and so now we can move on to highlighting that purple armour. And for this we're going to start out with some Genestealer purple, and again we're looking for edge highlighting, so sharp edges and corners, but there are some smooth areas to get with this colour too. But what we need to do is get it ready on the palette, again using that fine brush. I'm still using my 00 just here, and we just need to get some of this onto that palette, thin down as usual, making sure it's nice and smooth so that we have the control over it. So once you've got it down to about this point, we can start looking for the edges to pick out. If we take a look at the tail, what we've got is this central ridge running all the way down the armour just here, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to get. You can see that sharp line in the middle of each of these plates. Just want to do a vertical motion like this, just painting downwards using the tip of the brush just to get a line of this colour following that edge just along areas like that. So just basically work your way along like this. Now, as we're highlighting these areas, it does bring us to this face on here. Now, don't worry about that because we're going to come back to that later on. So you can basically just miss that entire area, but do keep an eye out for any edges that might appear around it, such as on the side of the tail. There are some edges of the armour plates and areas just here that we need to get. And also as we get towards the top, we actually have a soft kind of curve across this area here on the hips. Now, this also appears on the abdominals, and what we want to do is just add a bit of this colour where the light would catch. So that means a line in this rough region just going along here. So just follow the top of the curve where the light would catch it just around there. Once you've found all those edges and curves on that purple armour, the next thing to do is to put a finer highlight on those details, again because this is such a major model and we want to stand out a little bit more. So what we're going to do is add a fine highlight using some cacophony purple. Now once that's done, it's time for yet another purple, because we've also got to highlight those scales on the front of these sort of serpent bodies, so those larger, flatter ones. In this case, what we're going to use is some Slaanesh grey. But first of all, what we need is cacophony purple. And for this, again, go for your small brush and back to my 00 here. And this is just going to be a fine highlight on those purple armour panels on any parts that stand out more. So any areas where the light will catch it more, that sort of thing. So you don't need very much of this. There's not really that much to pick out with it, but it is important that we get it just to help this colour pop. And we're looking at areas such as these armour plates going down here. Because we've got that overhanging shadow from the plate above each one, we're sort of working our way up there. It means that what we want to do is just apply this little highlight just towards the bottom of each one. So just a little bit there, for example, a little bit down there, and a little bit down there. So you see it's very fine highlights in these sorts of areas. Now on these curves, such as the one around the sort of hip region just here, just want to apply a little bit of this towards where the light will catch the most. So we're looking at in the middle. So just very small areas such as that. With that, the purple armour is now finished, so we can move on to highlighting these scales that are down towards the bottom of the serpent body around here. And for this, I'm using some Slaanesh grey, and to begin with, I'm going to be applying it as an edge highlight following the edge of each of these scales. So you can see I'm just moving the brush around just to make sure we can follow along that edge with the tip of the brush, so we get a nice highlight following those areas there, again going around to these corners up here. Now once you've gone around like that, you can add a bit of texture to it, because there are some scratches and things in here, and to do that all we need to do is just do one or two little flicks along here, so just a few, just working our way along like that, just to give the impression of some texture on these areas. With that highlight applied, you can see now we've got a nice finish to those purpley scales on the underside of the serpent body, and with those extra lines added in, it's almost like there's nice texture there too, like they've been scraping over all the rubble as he's been crawling along. But with that done, what we now need to do is highlight that sort of wine red colour, and to do this, we're going to do some mixing. What I've got is some Galvorback red, and I'm going to introduce some elven flesh into it. And it's going to be for all the reddish parts, but we'll concentrate on the tail to begin with. What we need to do is set this up on the palette. You see I've got a dollop of elven skin just there, and I'm going to get some Galvorback red next to it on the palette. Now I'm using my size 0 brush for this one. And what I'm going to do first of all is create a lighter tone mix just here. So we're just bring the two paints into the middle and start to mix them together, and this way we can create the kind of tone we're looking for, which is something like that. Now bear in mind that elven skin is a stronger colour than Galvorback red, so just factor that in as you're creating the mix there. You'll definitely need much more of the red than you will of the elven skin colour. But we're aiming for something roughly in this region, and then to apply it, first of all, we're looking for the darker red parts, such as this fleshy part we've got on the tail just here. In this case, we're looking for the curved parts where the light will catch. So for example, it's going to be a case of just applying some running along that region just there, and along the back of it as well we've got a bit of a curve just going around here, so we just want to angle so we're nice and comfortable, and apply a bit of this colour on this region just here, just thinly applied. Now you can see it is quite weak colour, so you will have to apply 2 thin coats of it here just to build it up, but you see it's just a case of looking for where the light catches. Now when it comes to areas like the ribbons, look for it as an edge highlight, looking for sharper edges and corners just like we did on the armour. But there is one exception in this region, which is the almost rattle part that we've got on the tail just around here. In this case, we need to layer this on. So we're just looking for the flat of these rounded parts and just apply it quite heavily to this region, so this area starts to become distinctly lighter from the area beneath it. Now that we've finished applying that highlight, we're ready to take things a little bit further on these areas, and once again we're going to be using the same 2 colours, so it's going to be some elven skin and Galvorback red again, but this time with more elven skin put in, so we get a lighter colour here and a slightly more fleshy one too. Now to do this, I'm actually going for a smaller brush now. I switched to my size 00 for a bit more accuracy, and what we've got to do is mix these colours together, just going more into sort of the flesh colour just here. So getting a lighter tone, more like this is what we're aiming for with this one. Now also, I'm just going to make sure I've got some of the elven flesh on its own available, so I've got an even lighter tone ready, and we'll come to that in a moment. But what we want first is this mix just here. So with this, on the tail, we're looking to accentuate the parts that we were highlighting earlier on the darker red parts. So you can see we've got these highlight lines going around here. Just looking for the areas where the light would catch even more. So the top just here, and just apply a very small amount of this onto that brightest part. It's also going to be just along here on the underside of the little rattle parts, but just a fine highlight just running along there. So very small, very delicate parts. And on the fabrics, it's going to be the exact same thing on the peaks where it really stands out. And when we get around to the rattle part, what we're going to do is just apply this And so again, almost like a layer, but just a bit more focused towards the top of it. So just that sort of region just there, making it a bit lighter than the red we've got surrounding it. So very carefully into areas like that. Now, once you've got this colour on there, it's time to grab that elven skin that we haven't mixed with the other colour. And with this, we're just going to do a circular highlight going around the outside. So you can see just along here, it's going to apply a line of this colour just around there, taking it around over the top and then down the other side. So all the way around like this. And with that done, we've now finished painting all those wine red details, so it's time to move on to highlight some other features on the miniature. And we're going to start out with things like the horns and claws. For this, we're going to lean more into that sort of greenish tint. So I'm going to use some Cabalite green here, and then for a very fine highlight, I'm going to be using some ivory tusk. Now, once that's done, it's time to highlight the red leather, and here I'm going to go for some fur cloak. And then finally, for that black fabric, here we need a grey, so I'm going to use some Dungeonstone grey. But first of all, I'm going for some Cabalite green, and to apply it, you definitely want to go for your fine brush. I'm using my size 00 once again. This is going to be quite an extreme highlight on these features, and there are a fair few to pick out here. We've got things like the claws and the various teeth that appear in the armour, all that sort of thing. But I'm going to be starting out with the horns on Fulgrim's head, and you can see they've got these ridges on them. What we're doing here is a very fine edge highlight on each of them. So we just need to very carefully move in, and with the tip of the brush, just start picking out those ridges. So just along areas such as just here, just a flick of this colour so we get a bit of that brighter green, just catching the light on those edges. So along there, for example, and along here as well. Now, as mentioned, all those little teeth-like designs, and you can see they do pop out quite frequently. They're actually sticking out various bits of the armour, and with these, we just want to get a little bit of this paint towards the end of each one, just so they stand out. So along like that, for example, just sweeping the brush along those parts there like that. And then also, we've got this black leather gauntlet. Now, this has a greenish tint to it too, so what we're looking for are the shapes that stand out. And we just want a little bit of this colour where it would catch the light again. So areas such as the joints on the fingers and thumb, so areas such as just there, for example, just little flicks of that colour. And along the top of it, there's a little area between these spines that we've got. So just along here, just apply a very thin highlight running down here too, just for that leather catching the light. Once that's done, we can then move on to ivory tusk, and this is going to be a very fine highlight, almost a specular highlight on these green parts to give the impression of light glinting off them. So we're looking for all the sharpest edges and details, just the corners, and we're just going to dot this colour onto those parts. So you see it's just very delicate, just little bits of this colour on those areas. I've finished highlighting that green now, and you can see it's on all the horns and that leather, but also, if you look on the tail, you can see it appears on all the different claws and spines that we've got on there too, including the big spike at the end of it. And with that done, we're now going to move on to the leather that appears on the tail here. And with this, we're using some fur cloak. And this is for these straps around here. This is just going to be a pure edge highlight. So as neatly as possible with the tip of the brush, just follow the edge of each of these straps, just working your way around, changing the angle of the miniature as you need to make sure you're comfortable, so that you're nice and accurate as you apply this colour. With that leather is highlighted, so it's time to move on to these parts here. It's the black fabric, and for these what we need is a grey to highlight them. So in this case I'm using some Dungeonstone grey, and to begin with we need to apply this as an edge highlight on the outside of the fabric. So just angle your brush so you're just skimming along using the side of it and just follow it all the way around, so along edges such as that. Now in addition we do have some soft creases in the middle, and we just need to emphasise these a little bit. So we're looking at the peak of it, which is running down there in this case. Just apply just a small amount of this colour to that raised area, just going down there. With that highlight applied, we've actually now made really good progress on painting the miniature, because we've actually highlighted a real large amount of the physical shape of the miniature, but there are still some things to do, and one of them is quite a small and actually quite subtle detail. If you look on the box artwork at that ornamental wing that appears on the front of the armour and goes over one shoulder, it has a purplish tint towards the end of these sort of feather-like designs, so we're going to add that on now, and to do it, I'm going to use some Magos Purple, which is one of Citadel's contrast paints. Now I'm going for a size 0 brush to apply this, and the idea is that we're going to put on a small amount of this and then almost draw it out using water so it fades into the surroundings. So we only want to cover a small area at once by just getting some of this ready. And I'm actually going to add a touch of water to it on the palette there just to take the edge off it, so it's not going to be overwhelming on the miniature. And so what I'm going to do is just get some of this loaded on the brush, and then this is the wing that we're talking about just up here. The idea is to apply it to some of it. So say for example this region just here, just bring it over that gold, then quickly whilst it's still wet just wash your brush, make sure it's damp, and then just use it just to smudge it at the bottom there so it fades into the surrounding gold. Now you can see because this paint's a fairly weak one, you will have to do 2 coats of this to build it up, but it's a matter of just taking your time with it and not doing too much at once so that it doesn't become too stark. But again, it's the same process, just apply a small amount of it in this sort of region just here, then wash your brush, and whilst the brush is still damp, just draw that colour down into the gold beneath it. With that colour built up, you can see we've now got that nice purple tint appearing on that wing, so it's time to move on to the next detail, which is going to be all the silver. Now, for the most part, we're looking at sword blades here, but bear in mind there are some smaller silver trinkets around the miniature. For example, there are some things like rings that are amongst all those leather straps, so just keep an eye out for those as you do this. But what we're going to do is start out with a base coat of Surcoat silver here, so darker silver. Then for the wash, you want that purple tint once again. So here I'm going to use some Druchii Violet. But first of all, we need some Surcoat silver, and to apply this, I'm going for my size 0 brush to begin with, but change as you need to as you get to various details of different sizes. But with it, it's just a matter of getting that paint thin down as ever, and then identify the details and block them in. So for example, on the swords, we've got these blades here, which are all sorts of strange shapes, but we're looking for the actual cutting edge, and also these almost wavy designs up here and it further back here. But just keep an eye out from where it breaks to the actual hilt, and down here you can see that happens just around here. So just take your time working around the details that need to remain gold. Once those base coats are done, it's then time to apply a purple wash over all of the silver. And for this, I'm using some Druchii Violet applied with a size 0 brush. And it's just a matter of painting it all across the silver, just being careful not to get it onto the surrounding details. Once the wash is dry, we've now got some nice purple shading on all that silver, and on the blades there will be some areas where it goes a little bit patchy because they're quite smooth in parts, but that's not a problem because now we're going to layer all the silver to make it shiny once more before we play around with that purple a little bit on it. And for this, what I'm going to use is some plate armour, and to apply it I'm going for my size 0 brush, but as usual feel free to change as you need to depending on the detail that you're doing. But with this colour, the idea is now to do a thin layer on all the flat areas of the silver detail we've got. So on the swords, for example, it's going to be on the sides of the blades mostly. And we need to make this just a little bit translucent, just to let some of the purple show through as we apply it. So I'm going to bring it to about that point there. As usual, just make sure there's not tons on the brush so that we don't overdo it. And then we can start layering onto the blades. If we take a look at this one, for example, it's a matter of applying it thinly onto this flat area just here. So just a hint that purple still shows through, but you see doing this just evens out that colour, makes it nice, neat and tidy, and also very shiny. But as we get towards the base of the blades, that's when all the, weird slashy stuff's going on here. So in this case, what we've got to do is just make sure we avoid the recesses so as to leave the purple tint really showing in those parts. So you can see I'm just making sure I'm focusing on the raised up areas and being careful to avoid those recesses. With that layering done, you can see now we've got that really nice shine back on all the silver details. So it's time to move on to adding a bit more purple to them, because what we can do is use some Magos purple in a similar way to what we did with the gold earlier on to give them more of an intense purple towards the grips of the swords. Now with that done, it's then time to highlight all that silver, and in this case I'm going to go for some mithril blades, so a really nice bright silver here. But first of all, we need some Magos purple, and to apply it I'm going for my size 0 brush this time, and here the technique is going to be like what we did with that gold. Just need a small amount of this, and then we're going to apply it onto a small area and then use water just to draw it out. So for example, if I pick this sword that we've got just on the side right here, what I want to do is introduce this towards the crossguard around here. So I'm just going to apply some of this contrast paint over this part of the silver, just letting it run into the recesses and stain it with a bit more purple, bringing it up to about this point just here, at which point it's time to wash the brush. Just make sure it's damp with a little bit of water and just use it just to draw it up a little bit so it fades into the silver beyond. When you're happy with that purple tint at the base of each blade, the next thing to do is to highlight all the silver using Mithril Blade, and this is going to be an edge highlight on all those sharp edges and details. So just like we did the gold, where possible approaching using the side of the brush, just skimming along, but always looking for parts that stand out, such as these ridges that we've got on the blade just here. Look for the peak of them and gently pick them out with the tip of the brush. Once you've completed those highlights, we then finish painting all that silver detail, so it's now time for a big one because it's time to start painting in his skin. Now remember, the wings we've already undercoated using Wraithbone spray, and for the method we're going to use, it's now important that we make sure all the skin is the same colour. So what we need to do is base coat all the flesh on the upper torso using Wraithbone. Now to apply this, I'm starting out with my size 1 brush, but this is definitely one of those times where you will need to change brush as you go along, because some of the flesh is a bit tricky to get to, and around the fingers you do need to be careful because he's got things like rings on some of his fingers. So you just need to avoid those as you block this in. But it's a matter of making sure the paint is nicely thinned down and that your brush isn't overloaded, and then it's time just to start looking for all of that skin. So for example, on his face, I want to block this in entirely, just applying it quite smoothly so it doesn't clog up any details. So just take your time approaching it, just thinking you're going to have to apply 2 or 3 thin coats just to ensure you get a smooth finish before you move on to the next stage. Here we have the model with that base coat applied, and you can see I've just taken time to build up the wraithbone on all the flesh, including lots of the exposed flesh on the back just there. And well, with that done, what we're now going to do is start staining it for some purple and to get some shading in there. And to do this, we're going to use one of Citadel's contrast paints. Now, because we're going to be applying this on some quite large areas, particularly those wing membranes, what we are going to get is a bit of a blotchy appearance once it's dry. But that's okay, because what we're doing here is using the contrast paint in the way that it was originally intended to be used. So effectively, we're combining a base coat and a wash in one go here. So we're going to lay it and dry brush over it later on, and that's going to clean things up. But the reason why we're using it like this is because it's going to give us a very vibrant colour in those recesses, which is perfect for the sort of tone that we're going for here. So the colour to use is some Magos Purple, and to apply it, I'm starting out with my size 1 brush, but again, just change as you need to. So for example, on those wings, you'll want to switch to a larger brush to cover a large area quickly, but just change as you need, because what we need to do is make sure we apply the correct amount to each area. Now I'm going for a size 1 brush to begin with, and I'm aiming at Fulgrim's head for this first part. I'm just going to make sure I've loaded up with a fair amount on there, not tons and tons, but enough I think to cover the area. And it's just a matter then of picking a starting point and applying it straight over. So for example, on his head just around here, what we want to do is just get it on there and start pushing it around and poking it into all the recesses and corners like that, but also at the same time staining the raised up areas too. Now do be careful about other parts that we've painted so far as you're doing this. So you can see on his head, for example, we've got to be careful of the gorget just there. So I'm just going to be very careful, just poking the paint down there, trying to get underneath it, and also getting underneath his chin too as I go along. So it's this sort of strength that we're aiming for across all of the flesh. Once you've finished applying that contrast paint, and once it's completely dry, you can see just what I mean about how blotchy it turns out in some areas. But that's not a problem, because now what we're going to do is start cleaning things up, and we have got a really nice vivid purple colour here to really base things upon. And what we're going to do is start layering now with a mix. And what I've got is some Sorcerer's Cloak, but I'm going to be mixing it with some Flayed One Flesh to start to create our more fleshy tones here. So what we need to do is set that up on the palette. And what I've got here is my size 0 brush to do it. You can see I've already got some Sorcerer's Cloak there on the palette. I'm just going to put some Flayed One Flesh next to it, so a short distance away, so we can start mixing the two in the middle. And so what we're looking to begin with is to just bring the two colours together like that and start to create a tone that's roughly in this sort of ballpark just here. So it's quite a pale, almost greyish sort of purple. But then from there, we also need to create a lighter one. So I'm just going to put a bit more of that Flayed One Flesh in and create a lighter tone next to it. Just add a touch more purple in there, I think. There we go. So you can see what I'm generating here is a variety of tones. And the idea is that we're going to become more and more picky as to where exactly we apply these colours, getting it lighter towards more raised up areas on the musculature so we get a nice smooth effect on it. So I'm just going to get an even lighter tone prepared with just a bit more of that Flayed One Flesh just in there. And then I think we're ready to go. And what we're going to do is start out with this darker one just here. So it's a matter of making sure we've got it ready on the brush. As usual, just making sure it's thin with a little bit of water and that the brush isn't overloaded. And with this first colour, we're largely looking to layer almost all of the skin. Now, I'm just going to concentrate on an arm just here, but the same is going to be true across the entire miniature for all the flesh. Except in the wings, don't worry about the membranes, but do the fingers in amongst them. And what we are aiming for is a thin coat of this colour just applied onto the flatter areas. And you can see, because it's quite a thin colour, that vivid purple does show through, but what we're aiming to do is just leave the deepest colour of it just showing in the deepest recesses. So you can see on the arm I'm being quite picky here in that I'm just leaving a little dark area just there in that corner of the musculature right there. But I'm aiming on these flatter areas and then generally covering most of them. So you can see I'm being quite broad in the application as I work my way around here, just gradually building it up. Now, because the coat's quite thin, you can see it also dries quickly, which means I can go in for a second coat and just start to focus it a little bit more towards the more raised up part and the flatter part. So around there, for example, definitely some on the elbow just there. Then as we go down onto the arm, I want to really concentrate as we get down towards the wrist there. So we really build up that colour just around that part there. You can see now it's getting smoother and the colour's getting stronger. We're getting that really nice lilac almost. Now, once you've got that on there, we can then push further into those lighter tones that we mixed up. So now I'm grabbing that light colour I had, and with this one, again, because it's thin, we can gradually apply it as thin coats, but we're just focusing it now more towards the middle of these muscles that we started picking out. So on this one, it's going to be an area such as just here. You can see I'm not going quite as far as I did with the previous colour. So that previous colour is still showing as it dips into that recess, and it's just giving us a little bit more depth as we go along, but it's also now generating that really smooth tone on the flesh. Again, I'm just going to make sure I go around the elbow, just picking out that area, just being selective not to drop into those corners. And then going down towards the forearm once again. So looking at areas such as just there And also, we just want to bring it around the arm just here. Now, if you ever find you go too far, you can always drop back to your previous colour. So at the moment, the contrast between the colours is looking quite sharp in this region just here. So what I'm going to do is just, without even washing my brush really, just grab the previous colour, so that darker mix, and just reapply it into this region here. And what this will do is just even things out and just blend it together and gives a nice smooth gradient between the two. So just there, like that. So you can see this is just now a gradual process of building it up like this and just going a little bit lighter than this. So once you're happy with that slightly lighter tone that we've been applying just there, we can go to the even lighter one that I created. And with this one, it's now an even more precise application onto the parts that stand out, such as the elbow just here. But it's all steady progress, just gradually building it up. And you can see it's actually quite satisfying because it's very easy to get those nice gradients on the colours. So all we need to do now is carry on doing this across all the flesh. And remember on the wings, don't worry about the membranes for the time being, just concentrate on the fingers that go in between them. Once you've finished that stage, you can see now the flesh is standing out really nicely, being a lighter colour than the rest of the model, and also really bringing out Fulgrim's arrogant expression. And so now what we can do is just push that a little bit further by doing a fine highlight on here. And for this, we need an off-white. So I'm going to use some ivory tusk for this. And to apply it, definitely go for a fine brush. I'm using a size 00 here. And with this colour, we're just looking to accentuate the features that stand out the most. So it's going to be things like the bridge of the nose, his chin, cheekbones, that sort of thing. When it comes to the arms, you're looking at elbows, knuckles, that sort of stuff. So for example, on his face just here, all I'm looking at straight away is the centre of the face and really the bone structure of it. So we just want to get a little bit at the tip of the nose with just a bit of this colour just to help it pop out and just there like that. On the brows, we want to get some of this too. So I'm just looking at very carefully moving in and just picking out a little bit of that area there. And a bit on this side too. We can also get a little dimple that's almost in the centre there like that. We also want to do things like the cheekbones. So we're looking at the top where the light would catch, and it's just a little bit this colour in these areas. So you can see it's always a delicate fine highlight, but it just really helps finish the skin off. With that highlight applied, we've now finished painting that purpley skin, except of course for those wing membranes, and now it's time to do those. And here what we need is that sort of fleshy colour for the leathery texture we've got. So what we can do is dry brush it. I'm going to go for 2 colours for this. I'm going to start out using some elven skin, and after that we'll then do a highlight. In this case I'm going to use some flayed one flesh. We're going to start out with elven skin, and the dry brushing is quite particular for this stage. So to do it, what I'm using is a small dry brush here from Citadel, just to help out with the control, even though we are covering quite a large area. I'm going to start out with a fairly traditional dry brush, so just get a bit of that paint on the brush, work it into the bristles, removing most of the paint and really making sure we bring it down to about this sort of strength on the paper. And with this, we're going to start out by doing a soft dry brush where we're looking to get a bit of a gradient on the edges of the membranes. So if we take a look at this segment just here, for example, what I'm going to do is just start brushing it like this, just gradually building up that colour and being quite heavy as I put it on. But because there's not much paint on the brush, you can see it's going on nice and softly. And the idea is to get it so that we get a soft build-up between the two colours, between this purple and this fleshy colour in these corners where we meet the fingers on the wings. Now it takes a little bit of time to build it up, but you just got to keep going at it steadily like this to ensure you get that smooth gradient. So I'm just going to keep on going, applying some of this, making sure I'm soft around that edge just there, but being a bit heavier towards the middle. Doing the same down this side, again, just building it up, just making sure it's soft as we get close to the finger of the wing, but then just continuing to bring it down this area just here. Now, once you've got it built up and you're quite happy with that gradient, what we're then going to do is go in quite heavy towards the middle of each segment of the membranes to make this colour really strong and dominant in that area, to make it look really fleshy. So once you got to around about this sort of appearance on the membrane segment, it's then time to get much more paint on the brush and apply it very heavily right into the middle like this. So you can see I'm almost base coating it in this case. And what I'm doing is making sure it goes into all those little sort of breaks that we've got in the leathery texture, really working it into that area so it becomes solid this colour towards the centre. So just there like that. So you can see it's a matter of just building it up. I quite like to do one segment at a time for this, but you can see this is the sort of thing that we're aiming for. A little bit higher, just bringing it up a bit further towards the top just there. But we're aiming for this sort of strength, this colour on each segment. Build up that colour to this point, and then we're ready to move on to highlighting by dry brushing again, this time using flayed one flesh. And this is just going to be a light dry brush over each segment. More focused towards the middle, just very lightly on the outside edges, but heavier towards the middle. But this time we want to let some of that elven skin show through. So just gradually build it up to bring out the texture of each segment on the wings. With that highlight applied, the texture's standing out nicely, but in all that dry brushing we have lost some of the colour that appears around these veins that appear on the membranes of the wings. So what we want to do is just re-establish those now, and for this I'm going to go and use some Magos Purple once more. But this time the application is going to be quite precise, so I'm using my size 0 brush here. What we want to do is just get some of this onto the palette. We don't need to worry about thinning it down this time. I want it to be nice and strong. Just make sure you have a good point on your brush before you start applying it. And then to begin with, we want to run this directly into the deepest corners that we've got between the membrane and the actual finger on the wing. So areas like this, just run it into these parts just to make sure they're nice and dark so we get lots of contrast. Now as you encounter these veins, just run this contrast paint over the top of those parts too. So you can see along here, for example, I'm just bringing it up just to stain it with a bit of purple and just allowing that colour to settle in the recess around the vein just to get some distinction around that detail too. And with that, the wings are now complete, and so we can move on to the next feature, which is going to be Fulgrim's hair. Now for this, what we want to do is start out with an off-white so we can build up to that greenish tinted white. And so here I'm going to use some ivory tusk. To apply it, I'm starting out with a size 1 brush, but some of this is quite intricate, particularly around that Slaneshi crest that's on the back of his armour. So change brush as you need to, but the process is going to be the same regardless. Just need to block it in entirely with this colour at this stage. So once your paint is thinned and ready, we can start applying it, just being careful of the little gold trinkets he's got in there, and his horns as well as you apply it around here. But it's just a matter of making sure you get a nice even base coat before you move on to the next stage. I finished base coating the hair, and I did forget to mention, but the feathers that appear on the fabric, be sure to base coat those with ivory tusk at the same time, because now what we're going to do is apply a wash over all of these, and for that sort of greyish green appearance, what we're going to do is actually create a wash using some Incubi Darkness thinned down with Lahmian Medium. Now we want plenty of Lahmian Medium here, because what this essentially is going to do is give it the properties of a wash. So we need to set it up on the palette first of all. I'm using my size 1 brush to do this, and I'll just start out with some of the Incubi Darkness just so you can see what's going on here. Just going to get a bunch of that on the palette. Then make sure the brush is clean before getting any medium so that we don't contaminate it with any colour in the pot. But we just need to get plenty of this and put it next to the Incubi Darkness on the palette. So 1, 2, 3 and 4 should do it. And then just bring them together so we create a very runny version of that paint, which is going to act like a wash when we get it onto the miniature. So with that prepared then, it's time to apply it over the top of the hair and the feathers. And all we need to do is put it on just like a wash. So it's a matter of just making sure you identify where you want it to go, just applying it and letting it run into all those recessed details. That mix is now dry, so it's time to move on to neatening this up and then to highlight it. So what we're going to do is start out by neatening things by layering using some ivory tusk once again, and then for the highlight we need a pure white. So in this case we're going to go for some white star. But first of all we need some ivory tusk, and to apply this I'm going for a slightly smaller brush now. I've gone down to my size 0 for this one, and the idea now is to start picking out the raised strands of the hair. So we're looking to kind of emphasise that texture really, and on the feather, same thing, just looking to pick out the parts that stand out. So the trick to it is to make sure there's not loads of paint on your brush, and then if we look at the hair strands just here, want to approach them at this sort of angle so that we can just skim the brush across it, and this way the brush can't fall into those recesses between the strands, and so it gives us nice, well, it nicely picks out those strands very quickly and very easily. Now of course there are going to be times where it's quite tricky to get to the strands at this angle, so say for example on top of his head because the horns get in the way. So in this case just very carefully just make sure you're nice and steady, going with the tip of the brush and just pick out the raised area on each one. And then finally we can highlight this colour using some white star, and this will be on the feathers too, where we're just looking to accentuate the parts that stand out. So on the ends of the strands of hair, just flicking a little bit of this colour in those areas just to make them go brighter towards the end. Only the really large ones that stand out too, such as these ones along the top just here. Also be sure to definitely get these ones on the forehead, and again you will have to go in with the tip of your brush, just carefully picking them out just to highlight these details. With that, the hair is now complete, and so are those feathers. So it's time to move on to another detail, which is that piece of armour that we talked about earlier on, which has that weird like face that appears around his belly really on his armour, so on the serpent tail part. So what we need to do is paint that because it has more of a fleshy appearance to it. So for this, what we're going to do is go back to Phoenician Purple, which was our mid-tone for the armour, but now we're going to start introducing a sort of bone colour to make it a little bit more fleshy in appearance. For this, I'm going to be using some Vampire Fang. Now to apply it, I recommend going for a smaller brush. I'm going for a size 00 here, and you can see I've got a good puddle of Vampire Fang there on my palette, and I'm just going to get some Phoenician Purple next to it. What we're going to do is start out by just introducing a bit of the bone colour into it so we get a slightly lighter tone. So I'm aiming for something a bit more like that, and we want to do another one that goes even lighter than that. So as you can see, what I'm doing is just creating a bit of a sequence of colour going across there like that, just mixing it so we've got a nice little band of colours to choose from there. So with that prepared, what we can do is start applying the colour to it, and I'm going to start out with this slightly darker one just here. The idea with this one is to start looking for the more raised up areas as if we're going to be layering it. And what we're looking at is this face right here. So we're looking for the raised up detail, which is, well, it's quite a bit of it really to pick out. But all the while, what we're looking for are those recesses and just want to avoid them, leaving them with that dark purple showing. So you can see I'm looking for areas like that. Raised up parts here. We've got a bit that goes above this eye right here. So we want to follow that around there. Just applying it as a layer, always looking for those flatter areas and picking them out. Now once you've got some of this on there, you can see the detail of that face is starting to show. So now we can start going a little bit lighter. So it's time to grab that lighter mix that we created earlier on, once we've just finished that bit there around the mouth. So with a lighter colour now, we're just going to start to be a little bit more selective as to what we pick out. So on the brow, for example, just going to go a little bit higher, just following that around there, around the eye. Same on this bit just here, just going a bit further out. I'm going to do a little bit in the middle of this part just here, but just being careful not to go close to any recesses so it doesn't go too bright in those parts. But then we can go above the mouth, picking up that texture just there like that. So really it's a matter of just carrying on until you get to a point where you're happy, and you can go quite light on this. So for example, if I pick up some of the bone colour on its own, so some vampire fang on its own, we can apply it thinly and go quite extreme on it and get it quite bright. And you can see this way it's looking quite different from the armour plating, but it is starting to look a little bit fleshy and a little bit demonic. And with that, the demonic face is now painted, but we do still need to paint its eyes. And for this, what we're going to go for is like a demonic yellow. And later on, once that's done, we can also pick out Fulgrim's eyes and do all the eyes at the same time. But we'll start out with these yellow ones. For this, what we need first of all is some dark sun yellow, and then we're going to wash over them with some flesh wash to give them a sort of like slight reddish appearance in the corners. Now, once that's done, it's then time for a layer of skulky yellow, and then we'll finish off with a highlight of white star just in the middle just to complete them. Meanwhile, for Fulgrim's eyes, after this, what we'll need is a pitch black. So we're just going to use some Doom Death black here. But first of all, for the demon eyes, we need some dark sun yellow, and to apply it, you definitely want to go for your small brush once again. So I'm using my size 00 here. We just need a small amount of this, and then for each eye, we just need to paint the main majority of it, just leaving it darker on the outside from all that wash that we applied earlier on. So for example, this one just here, see I'm approaching with the brush, just running along the length of it. I'm just going to apply this colour just in the very centre, just steadily building it up, so we get that nice yellow around there. With that base coat done, we're then ready to apply a wash over the eyes, and for this I'm using some flesh wash. So a nice chestnut colour here that we just need to apply over each eye, just letting it settle in the recess around each one, just to give it a really nice warm hue. Once that wash is dry, we can then move on to Skulker Yellow. So a nice bright yellow here, and with this we're now looking to apply just a fine line across the middle of each eye. So just very gently in this region here, just letting some of that shaded yellow appear around the edges of this colour. And then finally, we just need a thinned white to finish off the eyes. So here I'm using some white star thinned down with a bit of water, and all we need to do is just introduce a little bit of this into the middle of each eye. With that done, those demonic eyes are completed, but we've still got the eyes to do on Fulgrim's head. And so here what we want is some pitch black eyes, so I'm using some Doom Death Black. And with this, we just want to very carefully go in using your smallest brush once more, just making sure to angle yourself around all this detail that we've got around his gorget. But all we're looking to do is just to run a little bit of this black in the deepest part of each eye. And with that, the eyes are now finished. So it's time to move on to the next detail, which is one that's quite small and easy to miss. And it is in fact a load of flayed skin, faces specifically, that are on the fabric pieces of the assembly. And so for this, what we're going to do is base coat them with a pale skin colour. So I'm going to use some elven skin here, then wash them with flesh wash to get some depth and definition. Now once that's dry, it's time to layer with elven skin once again. And then for the highlight, I'm going to go for vampire fang to make them really quite pale. We'll need to start out with that base coat of elven skin, and to apply it I'm going for my size 1 brush here, and for this first stage we just need to block them in entirely. So as usual, just make sure your paint's thinned down and ready, and just be careful to make sure there's not too much on your brush, and then we're ready to start applying it onto these details. And the faces I'm talking about are these ones around here, and for this first step all you need to do is base coat them entirely. Once you have an even base coat on each of those faces, it's then time to apply some flesh wash over the top of each one. And we just want to make sure it runs into all the nooks and crannies as we go along, and also don't forget to paint this on the back of each one as well. Once the wash is dry, we can then return to elven skin, and this time we need to layer the faces. Now I have switched to a slightly smaller brush for a bit more control. I'm using my size 0 here, and this is a case of looking for those raised up flatter areas and just carefully avoiding the recesses, such as around the nose just here, and also around the mouth down here. And finally, we can highlight these skins using some Vampire Fang. Now I have made sure to thin this down so it's a little bit translucent, and with it I'm now just looking for the features that stand out the most. So you can see I'm just working around this mouth just here. I also picked out the nose, but as I get further down I'm just going for what's left of the chin really, just around there, and also areas just underneath the eyes. Also the brow too. Now there's a few wrinkles standing out, so we want to pick those out as well. I go just along here, so you can see it's anything that stands out, just pick it out with a little bit of this colour. With that highlight applied, those skins are now finished, so we can move on to painting the final detail, which is going to be the green gems that are scattered all across Fulgrim. And for this, we need to start out with a base coat of a dark green. So here I'm going to use some Wyvern green. Now once that's on there, we then need to put a black wash over the top to darken it down further. So in this case, I'm going to use some Oblivion black wash. But first what we need is that green. So I'm going to use some Wyvern green for this, and to apply it I'm going for my size 0 brush, and we just need to base coat them at this stage. Now bear in mind these gems are all across the miniature, so keep an eye out for them because they're all sorts of different shapes and sizes too. But what we're looking at for our example are ones that appear on the serpent body here, because there's two nice large ones that are great for the example. I'm going to start out with this one that's on the forehead of this demon face, so we just want to neatly base coat this in just around here, but there's also one hidden away at the side just here, so I'm going to block that in at this stage as well. With that base coat applied, you're then ready for the black wash. So here I'm using some Oblivion black wash, and this just needs to be washed over each gem, just making sure it settles in the recess surrounding it where it meets that gold. So we get some nice definition between those two colours. Once the wash is dry, we can now highlight those green gems, and here what we're going to do is apply it in such a way to give the illusion that it's a glassy gem. And to do it, we need some brighter greens now, starting out with an emerald green. So I'm going to use some emerald green here, and then we're going to go brighter with some talisman green, and then we need a pure white. So here I'm going to use some white star once more. But first of all, we need some emerald green, and to apply this, I do recommend going for a small brush here. I'm using my size 00 for the application of this one. And the idea here is to apply an almost C shape to the gem, but in a particular area in the orientation of how the miniature is standing. So in the case I like to go for here, it's usually the bottom left. You can do different angles if you want to, but whatever you choose, make sure to stick to that throughout the entire miniature when you're looking at dead on when it's all assembled. So just bear that in mind. But what I mean then, for the case of this gem just here, I'm looking at the lower left in orientation of how the miniature is standing, which means generally painting it towards the bottom just here. And I want that sort of C shape going on, so it goes up that bit there, and it goes round and goes up this side too. Now what we need to do is just build this colour up so it's nice and strong. So apply that first coat, let it dry, then go in for a second one over the top of it. Just building it up, again in that C shape around there. Once that's done, we can then move on to a bright green, and here I'm going to be using some talisman green, and we're looking to apply this in the same sort of region, just slightly more narrow this time. So this sort of area just here, again that C shape, just building up that colour towards that corner so we get that nice bright green showing up around here. And finally, we're ready for some white star. And with this, I'm first of all just going to put a very small amount in the very deepest part of that bright green just down there. And then I'm going to do a little dot in the opposite corner to finish off the gem effect. And with this done, the miniature is pretty much finished, except for the base, of course. And it's time then to paint that base. Now, definitely do this before you do the final assembly, because when fully assembled, this model is quite fragile. But when it comes to the base, it is, of course, entirely up to you what scheme you go for. But in this case, I'm going to be going for an urban rubble base. Here we have the completed Fulgrim Transfigured, ready to go forth and spread decadence and evil across his father's crumbling imperium. So, not going to lie, painting Fulgrim has certainly been one of the most challenging videos that we've done for the Academy, and it's not because there's any particularly difficult painting techniques used to paint the miniature, it's just the sheer amount of fine detail on it. So if you are going to paint Fulgrim, just keep that in mind. It's not a particularly difficult model to do, it's just that it is going to require patience because there is a lot to do here. So remember, just take your time, one step at a time, and you'll get through it before you know it. And when you are finished, you're going to have a centerpiece miniature that you're going to be really proud of, and you're definitely going to want to show it off to everybody as well. So have fun painting Fulgrim, and we'll see you again very soon.